A Manifesto for Hope, Principle 10. People become what they believe. Many of our government-funded systems are failing the most vulnerable and disadvantaged. At the same time, we're sidelining our greatest national asset, local people. We have a stark choice: to keep pouring money into policies we know aren't working, or to invest in new and better ways that really improve people's lives. We need a radical reset, one that empowers local charities, grassroots movements and faith groups in a more imaginative, less bureaucratic, more collaborative approach to community development. I'm Steve Chalk. My book, Manifesto for Hope, sets out 10 tried and tested practical principles for how to develop joined up, cost-effective, community empowering work, each gleaned from the hard-won experience that sat at the heart of my work over the last 4 decades. It culminates in a call for a new social covenant, one that will transform the life chances of countless young people and families. It's time to reimagine. It's time for a manifesto for hope. Principle 10. People become what they believe, with my special guest and expert witness, Chine McDonald. Chine is the director at Theos, the UK's leading religion and society think tank, and was previously head of community fundraising and public engagement at Christian Aid. Chine, welcome.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming in. That's really kind of you. I know you're a very busy person. You really are. But I'd like to talk to you about Principle 10 in my book and then just pick your brains, because I know that you thought about these issues a great deal. Principle 10, as I've just said, is called People Become What They Believe. A story that I heard years and years ago and often repeat is the story of a rabbi called Akiva. Akiva lived a century or so after Jesus. And Akiva he was a shepherd to start with, and became this much followed scholar. In fact, you won't walk into any synagogues without them being able to tell you a story too about Rabbi Akiva. Anyway, Akiva was a great storyteller, and he told a story about one day wandering home from the market down by the side of the Sea of Galilee, and he lived in Capernaum. And he was supposed to deliver all these vegetables home for evening supper. But the problem was, he says, he got lost in his thoughts. And getting lost in his thoughts, instead of taking his turn off to his village, he just kept wandering. He got kind of completely lost and didn't wake up to where he was actually headed until, as dusk descended, he heard this voice above him and in front of him. And it shouted to him, "Who are you? Why are you here?" And suddenly he woke up and he looked up and he'd reached the fortress that the Roman Empire had by then erected on the road he was on. And in the turret, in the tower at the top of this, there was a Jewish boy dressed in a Roman uniform who was shouting at him, "Who are you? Why are you here?" The way Akiva told the story was, being a rabbi, he thought before he answered either of those questions. And in the end, he shouted back up to this lad, "Who are you? Why are you here?" The kid is a bit taken back. And then he says, "I am employed by the Roman army to ask people like you, who are you? Why are you here? What are you doing?" Akiva thinks about it again, and then he answers with another question instead of an answer. He says, "So how much do those Romans pay you to stand in that turret and shout at people like me those 2 questions, who are you, why are you here?" The young man thinks about it, and he says, "They pay me 5 drachma a week." Akiva thinks about it again. And he says, "I'll tell you this, I will double that to 10 drachma a week, if you will come down from that tower and commit to me that you'll stand outside my front door every morning, and as I get up, shout at me, who are you? Why are you here? And it's a brilliant story, isn't it? I mean, he's got many brilliant stories, had many brilliant stories. It's a brilliant story because it really sums up, life's biggest questions. Who are we? Why are we here? And so that's why I called this principle 10. People become what they believe. The other 9 principles leading up to this, Chine, are about leadership and about building trust and about building relationship and about working with people, not against them. And it's about how we need to engage ordinary people, as I've just said, mums and dads and grandmothers and granddads, aunts and uncles, and people who live on a street and know a community in our community development work. But what I say in this last principle is that I've learned over the years that internal question needs to be asked of people as well in the schools, through the schools we run and the community we do in this country and other countries around the world. I've slowly learned that there has to be that inner narrative. Who am I? Why am I here? Which kind of brings purpose and meaning. However you answer that question, I once heard Oprah Winfrey say, actually, these were the only 2 questions that we all owe it to ourselves to answer, or at least to search for an answer to. Because I work in education a lot, I don't go through many weeks without listening to someone talking about Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I'm sure the same is true for you. Everybody talks about Maslow's hierarchy.
I live with a social worker who goes on about Maslow's hierarchy of needs.
There you go.
So I'm very familiar.
And the extraordinary thing about it is Maslow, well, it's probably, now your husband's name's Mark, isn't it?
Yeah.
So Mark probably kind of adds this bit in. But as I hear about Maslow's hierarchy, of course, the top of that triangle, you go from your basic needs in life, air and food and water, et cetera, and there's 5 levels in this hierarchy, and the pinnacle of it is self-actualization. And human beings have got to reach this place, if they can, of self-actualization so that they are fully functioning. And this has worried me for a long time because it strikes me, now I'm no sociologist, but it strikes me that a lot of the most self-actualized people I know are a pain in the neck. They're very self-actualized, and I'm sure you can think of more than one global leader who is very self-actualized, and that's the world's problem.
Yeah.
Now, the interesting thing is I finally dug into all of this, and I read about Maslow, and I read some of Maslow, and in the last years of his life, he basically abandoned his hierarchy. Now, that is something not many people will tell you. Well, it wasn't quite like that, actually. The hierarchy stood there, but he wrote in a couple of books and in various articles about what he called the 6th level. And he said that the 6th level was self-transcendence. Not self-actualization, but the transcendence of yourself. In other places, he calls it ego transcendence. And he said that ego transcendence, self-transcendence, awakening, he calls it in one place, spirituality, you could say, was as important to every human being as vitamin C or calcium. He said, unless we reach that place of self-transcendence, seeing beyond ourselves, beyond our ego, beyond our own needs, unless we see the bigger picture, we get stuck in life. And that self-actualization without self-transcendence became a crippling factor, not just for the possessor of self-actualization, but for those surrounding him or her. An extraordinary thing. Because he died soon after, he died in 1970, actually, and because he died soon after writing this, he never did integrate it into his hierarchy. And if he was here, the thing I'd ask him is, could he have done? Because it strikes me that self-transcendence isn't a progression beyond self-actualization. And some of the people I know and have read about and been inspired by in life, they didn't have all those lower things, but they did have a self-transcendence. I think of, Nelson Mandela, Like, he didn't enjoy all those things, but he found a place beyond himself where he was willing to invest in his life. In others, Mother Teresa, Emmeline Pankhurst. You can go on and on. People who laid down what could have been for them in order to serve others. So it strikes me that Maslow might have found it hard to stick this at the top of his pinnacle, but self-transcendence becomes a really important thing. For some years, I don't know how this happened to me. Well, I do know how it happened, but I don't know why. I was appointed by the UN. I worked for the UN for 8 years, and they appointed me as their special advisor on community action against human trafficking. I think actually how it came about was I'm partly Indian, and we work in India. Oasis works in India, and we work in the slums of the big cities. And I began to realize that kids were just being kidnapped, taken into domestic servitude, trafficked for sex, very often even body parts, horrendous. And so I began to campaign around that, and cheekily went to the UN headquarters in Geneva without being asked, and kind of presented myself and said, what's going to happen about all of this? And it's a strange story because they had no time for me really. But they said, if you can get 100,000, or perhaps it was 500,000, I said I could get 500,000 people to sign a petition to say that we've got to do something about human trafficking. And the guy I went to see, he laughed at me and he said, you'll never do that. Well, the funny thing is, in fact, he said to me, if you do that, you can come and speak at, we're going to have a worldwide conference on anti-human trafficking. Well, the thing is, I did do it. Well, actually, I got a load of friends to help. And we got however many signatures. They all fell off their chair. And then they asked me to speak at this conference. And I spoke at this global conference. And then they appointed me as their special advisor. I don't know why I tell you all that. But what I discovered then, in the 8 years I spent working alongside them, is that in the Convention of the Rights of a Child, physical, mental, social, and spiritual health are held central. It's clearly physical health is important to every child, mental health, social health, so important. And this was at the heart of my work with them. But they held alongside that, in their Convention on the Rights of a Child, spiritual health. And there's this kind of growing consensus that spiritual health, well-being, is vitally important. But at the same time, Chine, I always think, that's fine. But when you say, so what does spiritual health consist of? No one's got a clue. That's when it all falls apart. We know that spirituality is important, but we're not really sure what spirituality is. And of course, my background, I'm a Baptist minister, and I grew up, and I think I found, if I've ever found it, that moment of self-transcendence in becoming a Christian. I remember that was through going to a little youth club. And I remember this evening when I was 14, I felt my life's about more than me. I was always so wrapped up in myself, honestly, I was. And I came from a mixed race family, and I knew what racial prejudice was, and we were poor, and I was so bothered about it all. And this evening, I remember when it was a Friday night, wandering home from this youth club, I suddenly realised through this little crisis that I was consumed with, that my life had to be about something other than me. I suppose that's what Maslow would call that self-transcendence thing. I've found actually that you have to carry on having lots of crises because you keep sinking back into yourself if you're not careful to lift yourself out of it. But for me, it was formal religion. But I think that what Maslow was talking about, of course, was something bigger and wider than that. There might be a formal religion, but it's an event, a crisis of some sort. We live in a diverse population with all sorts of religions and non-religions and worldviews, but it's that thing that lifts you outside of yourself, that brings that kind of moment of enlightenment. And one of the things I say in the principle that I write into this book is interesting. Everybody is down on religion. I often say to people, religion, it's kind of Latin. It means to religament. So a ligament is the thing that gives you joins bones together and gives movement. And religion means to religament yourself, reconnect yourself. That's what it literally meant to start. Reconnect yourself, with others, and with God. That was it. It wasn't the rest of it. It wasn't the rituals. It was that reconnection. And it strikes me that that was what Maslow was talking about as I've read his stuff around this, that it's that self-transcendence that connects you to the bigger story, to the bigger vision, to the bigger picture. Who are you? Why are you here? Those kind of questions. And that, it strikes me in the work that I do with so many young people around the country. We have some 35,000 students in our schools, and I sit and I talk to them. That sense of self-understanding, of meaning, of purpose that is so important for everyone. It's kind of, for what happened to me when I was 14 was almost an epiphany. It was an awakening. It was suddenly I was jerked out of my little world into something bigger, a bigger story, a bigger narrative, which I have to keep reminding myself of and all the rest of it. But I was kind of jerked out of the ordinariness of my life to something beyond myself. And as I kind of travel through the years and talk to friends, it's not just that this could be a form of religion. It's that these things get mixed up. It's a film. It's a poem. It's going to the theatre. It's seeing something so stirring that you've got to live differently and be differently. Any of those things. It's looking at a great work of art. It's looking at an extraordinary statue, whatever it might be, walking by the beach, but you wake up to something beyond yourself, a dinner with some friends or whatever it might be. But it strikes me that in this mystery of awakening, we find ourselves, and these crises become pivotal in our lives. Now, one of the things that I've become involved in over these last 5 years particularly is within Oasis, we're stretching towards this in the next few months, opening the country's first secure school, which is an alternative to a youth jail. So we managed to get the law changed. We're the first charity, we're told, by the Ministry of Justice ever to be given the opportunity of working with children that have been sentenced by the courts. So, a horrible term, but a child will be sentenced to us. But then we become responsible for their development and their restoration. So we're going to call this establishment Oasis Restore. It's about restoration. And the reason I tell you that is it means that the last 5 years of my life, I've spent a lot more time talking to psychologists and psychiatrists and anthropologists and neuroscientists and neurologists and criminologists, etc., 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 and all sorts of meetings with them, spoken at conferences with them and to them and all the rest of it. And I realised something that I would have never understood had we not gone down this path. You can go to a conference of that group of academics and they talk about, it took me by real surprise to start with, they talk about shame. And they talk about their categories are shame and guilt, stigma, redemption, hope, desire, reconciliation, atonement, dignity, mercy, forgiveness, restoration. It's incredible. And then I suddenly realised that when I go to all those theological conferences, they talk about exactly the same set of things. And yet these two worlds haven't been joined up together. And it strikes me in what we do at Oasis Restore, there's no point in telling a young person that their life matters until they believe it, until they have some purpose and meaning and direction. Who am I? Where do I fit in? And I think people have been switched off religion, formal religion and all this, because of fundamentalism. Fundamentalism that wants to tell you that you're a sinner and you're guilty and lay endless levels of stigma on you and shame on you rather than hope. And I also think growing up a little bit in that some of the Christianity I grew up in, hope was postponed until a life beyond this one. It didn't have much to do with what was going to happen to me in the next 10 years or 20 years. For now, it was all beyond. And I think that trivializes things. But I think the chapter in this book, this principle, is trying to call people back to thinking about the centrality of this inner narrative, this inner journey, to this place where I know who I am. And I've met friends. I met a guy who was a Muslim. He was Jamaican, became a Muslim. And it was simply that he went to a nightclub. He was listening to a rapper, and his life was all about drink and sex and drugs, his own description of it. And he listened to this Muslim rapper talking about peace. And he says he went down to him afterwards and he got in conversation with him. And then he went along to the mosque and he began to sit down and talk. And he converted to Islam. And then his dad kicked him out of home because his dad was always drunk on rum, etc., etc. But over the years saw such a change in his son's life, he gave up drink and all the rest of it and now works for a charity. So that this restoration came to them through this discovery. I've got a friend who, much the same thing happened to him. He walked into a church one day with a gun in his pocket, South London, because he was part of a gang and he knew people were after him. And the gun was loaded. And he sat there with it in his trousers pocket, ready to shoot someone if they came in. But he says he was just overcome. He said he didn't even know what it was. It wasn't even that he was listening, do you know? Yeah. But he was just overcome. And in his own words, he says, I felt like the Spirit of God, like my life was caught up into something bigger. Now, all that was at least a decade ago. We now work with him in an ongoing basis. It's absolutely amazing. So it's that intervention. I've got a friend who recently retired from Oasis, and she became a head teacher with us. And she told me the story about how she grew up in a home where she knew her dad hated her and her mum had no time for her. And she said at school, I was just a nightmare because I took my anger at who I was out on everybody. Was thrown out of endless lessons, detention, etc., every day standing in the corridor. And she says that one year, a new head teacher came. A woman with a fearsome reputation, she said. And she was chucked out. I think she told me it was a science lesson. She was chucked out, standing in this long corridor in this old school. And then this woman starts coming up the corridor and she knows it's the new head teacher. And she's heard how stern she is. And so this big woman comes moving towards her and stops and looks down at her. She was 12 and says, "What are you doing here?" And she said, I gave her all they hate me, it's a terrible lesson, it's a terrible teacher, they're terrible. And she said, I gave her all this stick. And she said, this big woman just stood there and cried and then walked on. And she said that night she went home and she laid in bed and she couldn't work out why someone had cried for her. But the next day, she said, I went back to school and I determined that if the head teacher cried for me, I was never going to be thrown out of a lesson again. And her life was transformed by that crisis. It strikes me, Chine, that what we have to do is move beyond just IQ and the rest of it and intelligence as facts, towards a place where we understand that purpose matters and allow our lives to be caught up in something bigger. People become what they believe, and what they come to believe of themselves, they fulfill.